Hi there, I'm Mark, and this one is about Fume. So the author is Phillip Hall, who has his own booktube channel. Wonderful channel. It's so vibrant and vivacious. Wonderful to follow, and he talks really in depth about books or certain types of books. Definitely should go over and have a look. And subscribe if you haven't already. And he's a poet. And as he says in the notes at the back here, the blurb, Phillip Hall writes from the edge of language, the edge of mental illness, and that's something that's really in the book here that comes across. And from the perspective of a non-Indigenous poet and teacher, standing at the edge of Indigenous culture and community, carrying generosity and love alongside the ongoing trauma of dispossession. It's a hymn and a love song for Borroloola on the Gulf of Carpentaria. So this book is really centered on the Northern Territory. And what's interesting about the Northern Territory, it used to be part of Southern Australia. I think it was given over in 1911, but it's not a state. It's a territory, vast land. And Alice Springs and Kagadoo National Park, which on the map, as you can see, is in the northwest. And I think it was Crocodile McDundee who made it famous. Borroloola is on the MacArthur River. There's actually a wonderful channel I come across of a guy called Mikey or Mickey who does fishing around the Gulf of Carpentaria, and he has videos on the Borroloola. Phillip is Australian. He's from the Blue Mountains, and this is the bit that's called Bad Debt. And sorry, Phillip, you know I butcher books, but when it's your own, apologise. He was the artful dodger escaping jobs, and he had a daydream. He said, I was a lost Aboriginal, defiant, living in Eden, with almost no sense of the cruel barbs of colonialism's crooked paths, even though my best friends were 3 Aboriginal boys. There's a lot to say about the book. Specifically, a bit more about Phillip, but also his journey, where it took him in the Northern Territory, but also this post-colonialism, which really resonates with myself. So I live in New Zealand, but I'm British, birth, citizen, extraction, left in 2007 when I was 43. And I travelled in the Navy. I'd been to Australia, so I did a trip to Perth and Sydney, Newcastle, Cairns. I've done a round the world trip with my families and come to Australia. That doesn't mean I know it. What I know is what I saw, and it was very Western. And of course it was part of the Commonwealth. English speaking, different accents, of course, pretty much the same. Drive on the same side of the road. So there's nothing jarring. And it was the same with New Zealand when I came here before I moved. But when I came out here, I realised what I brought with me was not just what I put in my bags and my family. It was the straitjacket of Britishness. I moved to the Bay of Islands and I was teaching there. And I had to learn that the way you teach in England and the words you say don't always go down very well when you're outside of England. And it's just using simple words and phraseology that when you're in a culture here which is predominantly Pakeha, which is white settlers, and Maori, although that's changed over the time I've been here. The Maori, I was in the Bay of Islands at near a place called Waitangi, and that's where the Treaty of Waitangi, which is so central to New Zealand's thought, mind and politics, is. And then I got involved with some university ethics departments, and looking at work, it became apparent that some of the use of languages that some students were using could very easily upset the Maori. It was this almost use of superiority and use of language, put downs, but not realising it. So when, in this book, because I'm not talking about New Zealand, I'm talking about Australia and the Northern Territory, Phillip, when he talks about the barbs of colonialism's crooked paths, it just instantly resonated. And he said, looking back on those childhood ramblings, I might wish that our joy had been more lasting, that play could somehow find a path through the thicket of race, but of course colonial colours are indelible. As an adult, I have been an outdoor educator. All of my expeditions are intended to foster respect for first Australians and are based on a model of minimum environmental impact bushwalking in difficult and trackless terrain. And for me, this is just a wonderful sentence coming up now. I reject the idea of wilderness as racism, yet another version of terra nullius. In other words, and I've said it myself when I first came to New Zealand, oh, well, let's go down the South Island, it's wilderness down there. No, it isn't. People live there. People have always lived there. And to see these trackless expanses on the map, and let us not beat about the bush here, forgive the pun, the Northern Territory is still people's lands. Phillip, as far as I can understand, went or chose Borroloola. It was an advert. In 2011, he saw a position vacant for a sport and camp teacher at Borroloola in the Northern Territory's Gulf of the Carpentaria. And I'm going to mispronounce some of these words. I do apologise. And I apologise to Phillip and to the people concerned. Because again, this is colonialism, isn't it? Can't even get the names right. Yanyuwa country. After close of 150 years of massacre and dispossession, the town is also shared with members of the Gara Mara Agudanji peoples. And it's an interesting place, Borroloola. It's on this river. Very small population, which swells at certain times of the year, specifically for a rodeo, which is considered one of the last great bush rodeos. But also in recent years, looking or listening to a couple of videos I've looked at, people can, or especially retirees, go out there in the mild weather for camping and so on. The Gulf was once home to at least 12 indigenous language groups. 4 remain. That's shocking. And a map of the Gulf includes such places as Massacre Hill and Skull Creek. And that tells you all you need to know. Phillip says anger and loss is locked inside Borroloola's first Australians, who make up around 95% of the town, which, as I said just now, 600 or 700 in the dry season. It's poorly maintained and inadequate housing, but during August rodeo week and in the wet season, it could swell to 1,000 or 1,200. Any health problems, sleep deprivation, there's a lot of scabies, boils, head lice, plethora of stress-related illnesses. Only missionaries, mercenaries and misfits moved to the territory, it was said. But he considered himself, this is Phillip, a missionary and a misfit, who believes in education, proselytizing the downtrodden, and self-sacrifice. And that certainly comes across in the book. But what sets this apart and raises it, I mean it's good anyway, but really raises it now, to world importance I would say, is that it's not just this, here's a white fella going into these back countries. It had an effect on him, and a serious one, and he talks about it. My good fight now includes a slippery dependence on alcohol, so common in the territory, self-harm, severe depression, including an attempt to take my own life. He was air-vac'd out of Borroloola to Darwin Hospital. So he went in as a white fella amongst these people, but he was adopted. He became friends with a lady who became one of the most important people in his life. So what we have and what unfolds, I'm not going to say much more about this because this is the book you need to read, is that he talks about how he was welcomed and how it affected him and changed him. He does mention that he was adopted into her family and the Gudanji culture. He says here, she discerned that she was my nana, or Awuju, and then he was given a skin name, and again, apologies, this is terrible, the pronunciation, Jabala, or Jabala. My traditional bush name would be Gijindaraji. It was one of the proudest days of my life, he said, and began a long journey of discovery and enculturation that often saw me out on bush with the Gudanji family on holidays and weekends. And his first book, Sweetened in Coals, was launched 2014. Just to finish off, and this will be the part that we'll finish off talking about specifically Phillip for now. It's right at the end, quite a big piece, and I am very happy to read all this out. This is what Phillip says. I should have been more resilient, but I wasn't, and it made me sick. After my breakdown, when I could no longer do the work that I loved so much, I was filled with shame for a long time. I am still knotted with it, and with the scars of my self-harm. Am I returning to health? Can the Borroloola kids, whom I love so much, expect the same opportunities that I assumed as a boy running amok in the Blue Mountains bush. So it's an eye-opener, not just to see how it affected somebody that was outside that culture, but also the culture themselves. They have suffered quite a lot. And also, and I saw this on a video, that it was a bunch of kids who I assume are in the school that Phillip talks about in the book, and that he came across some students. Some were quite confrontational. They had to lock down the school at one point because of a guy throwing stuff at it. But these kids they're doing a reenaction out in various locations to a song they've recorded. But it talks about the fact that beware, because the names and the people that are shown on the video may no longer be alive. So it's a cultural thing. And he talks about note regarding cultural sensitivity and also use of certain words, which he's got a poem called Walk Up Tank Hill, and he mentions a word, but in English we would not bat an eyelid, possibly it's foreskin, but in their culture, the local culture, it is insensitive, so you have to be careful of that. So if you came across this and you just read it out, you may not realise as a non-Indigenous person, as a non-First Australian, that you are actually being insensitive to their culture. And I've come across this with Maori and so on. Colonial thinking, which is a real thing. And I am absolutely, I consider myself blessed to have gone through that process, to know that the way we just dismiss certain things, as being indifferent, the word wilderness, outback, as though, that's something out there, that's not worth thinking about. Well, no, it's the land. And certain peoples are very tied to their land. It's their homeland. And so on. It is primarily a book of poetry. Now, I've gone through all of them. One, definitely, I feel confident I could talk about, because when it comes to modern poetry, I'm still learning. And I've been actually following Phillip on some of an old conversation he had about the use of language and how it forms in the mouth and the pleasure of words. But I'm used to a different kind of stuff, mainly from the Renaissance 18th century, which has rhymes. So I'm learning. I'm happy to admit that I'm going to butcher this. It's called Fallen, and it's after Barcroft Boakes Where the Dead Men Lie, some of whose Earth's loved sons certainly committed massacres of first Australians, and for the Diwararuru who wanted a bush ballad. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read it. I'll try and do it justice, and we'll put images to it. But I have to be careful with the images, because although they'll be AI generated and they're not real people, it could be seen as insensitive. So I apologise in advance for that, and it's not meant to be insensitive. So here we go. In caves of commemoration, that's where the bones now lie. On Nibaya blasted earth tessellations, that's where the blood was let dry. Out where the cattle were bred free from natives in a barbed wire, stock-whipped polity, out where violence carries on. Washed in the Billabong's brown flow, over where the slain now lie, where emu gifts water lily so people grow, that's where the slain now lie. Constructing ground ovens and stone wall fireboxes, processing a commonwealth's measured, speared sprawl, out where havoc is now strong. For centuries exotic trade flourished, out where the slain would lie. In these relations First Nations were nourished, out where the slain would soon lie. The first boat people were heralded by conch shell, as traders carrying tobacco, arrack and metal, for trepang and shells of pearl and turtle, out where nourishment was sung. In these wastes Britannia rails at failure, so that's where the slain now lie. In the wild times cattle struggled to prosper, so that's where the slain now lie. With the liberal use of powder and ball, Britannia dispatches after herding them all, Over cliffs, bones bearing grim evidence of the fall, out where the victors pervade. The 5.77 caliber Snider is a splendid civilizer, out where the slain now lie, firing a massive mushrooming reminder, out where the slain now lie. And the Martini Henry's rapid rate of fire brings them to a standstill, a 45 caliber choir, unleashing on the obstinate a thresher's ire, out where the mighty are gun barrel straight. The lawless frontier made reprisal inevitable, out where the slain now lie. And a bloodhound's payback is irrevocable, out where the slain now lie. Rukawolma is the Gulf's resistance fighter, shadowing troublesome ghosts, tracking tighter the nulla blaze of his own notorious fire, out where the range smoulders and glows. In caves of commemoration, that's where the bones are let lie, all but rubbed out in civil predation, out where crystal memories lie. Sung in milk quartz, trauma is milled in corralled country that is disturbed, yet defiant and bull-necked still, because that's where history lies. Wonderful. And what a great thing to have written for a memory of people that probably would ordinarily have been forgotten. It's a really good book. And again, it's one of those things that I am rereading. Add a little bit at the end about the fact that Burulula, 2011 to 2015, that when he lived there, substance abuse is rife, especially of sugar, tobacco, ganja and alcohol. And too many young people have criminal convictions for petty violence. The beauty of the written word, like anything that's ever been written, is that if it's preserved and talked about, it will always be remembered. I mean, I've said it before, ad infinitum ad nauseam, that we die twice. We die physically, but we also die when no one's talking about us. And anybody who can get us to think about people that we've never met in places we've never been, it's a wonderful thing. And that's what Phillip has done here with Fume, about a place and people. And of course, the perception that we have of time is not what I know people in that part of the world have. It would be a discourtesy not to talk about it. It would be a shame. It would be actually a disgrace. So I'm all for a book like this, and I think Phillip should be heralded as having written it and also talked about himself and how it's affected him. This is the thing. You're not just reading words, you're reading a place and a time and how it affects somebody, and it should affect ourselves. Very powerful stuff. And some of the poems are a challenge to myself from my background, my lack of full understanding of the cultures concerned and the place and time and so on. I mean, Hand Payback here out. He says, claimed in 1883 as the largest station ever, by 1900 whole tribes were decimated in that big ride round through the ranges. You talk about mounted police and stockmen at sport with a lead brand, herding whole clans. They were treated like animals. Unbelievable. And slightly off topic, but I assume it's related, because Australia's a huge country and it's different peoples. But Rabbit Proof Fence was a movie that really opened my eyes. Wonderful movie. We used to show it at school in the UK. And it was how, in the 1920s, children from people in the north were literally, physically kidnapped, abducted, to become servants for other white people further south. And it didn't end until 1973. I was 9 years old. If I lived in that part of the world, I could have ended up being abducted. It's appalling. And you think of the overweening, overbearing arrogance that entails. And it's not just in Australia. It's in quite a few countries and still is. So, yeah, it's definitely something that I would recommend anybody to buy and dip into, because it's liberating. So thank you, Philip. Wonderful book, and I hope I've done it justice. Ta-ta for now.